Um, so I've been staring at this timeline of the interwar period today.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, basically the 20-year sandwich between World War I and World War II. And honestly, it feels like watching a slow-motion train wreck.
It really does. It is the ultimate historical frustration.
Right. You look at the dates, you look at the treaties, the
hmm
memos, and you can see every single missed signal. It's just maddening.
Well, we often look back at history and think, events were inevitable, like gravity.
Sure.
But when you really dig into the diplomatic archives of the 1920s and 30s, you realize World War II wasn't an accident.
Right.
It wasn't bad luck. It was a very specific failure of decision making.
And that's the path to catastrophe that our sources are talking about for today's deep dive.
Hmm.
We usually think of World War II as this very clear-cut good versus evil narrative.
Exactly.
But looking at this research, especially regarding the diplomatic failures, it seems way more like a story of calculated aggression versus paralysis.
Paralysis is the perfect word for it. Because what we're going to unpack is how the trauma of the first war,
The war to end all wars.
right, how that actually created the psychological conditions that made the second one possible.
Yeah.
And we really have to talk about the three-way cage match of ideologies here, because the source material makes it incredibly clear that this wasn't just a simple duel between democracy and fascism.
Right. And that's exactly where I want to start for you listening today. Because before we get to the tanks and the actual invasions, we have to understand the map.
The lay of the land.
Exactly. I was reading through the section on geopolitical distrust, and it paints a picture of a Europe that is completely fractured. It's not two sides, it's three distinct corners.
Correct. So in the blue corner, you have the Western democracies, Britain, France, and a very distant isolationist United States.
Who are totally withdrawn.
Completely. And these democracies, they are the established order, but they are tired, they are broke, and they are deeply traumatized.
Then in the black corner, you've got the rising challengers, the fascist states.
Italy under Mussolini, Germany under Hitler.
Right. They're aggressive, they're rapidly militarizing, and they genuinely feel like the international system is rigged against them.
But the piece that often gets ignored, and the sources really emphasize this, is the red corner, the Soviet Union.
Communism.
Yes.
And this is the part that always confuses people, I think. If Hitler was so obviously dangerous, screaming about war and racial purity right off the bat, why didn't Britain and France just call up Stalin and say, hey, we don't like you, you don't like us, but let's team up to crush this guy in the middle?
I mean, it seems like the logical move, doesn't it?
It really does.
But you have to remember that in the 1930s, the Western democracies viewed the Soviet Union with absolute horror.
Yeah.
The sources described them as being in diametric opposition. The British aristocracy and the French political class feared communism almost as much as that, or honestly, in some cases, more than they feared fascism.
Because communism directly threatened their property, their religion, their entire social structure.
Precisely. It was an existential threat from within. So you have this fatal hesitation.
Right.
The West absolutely would not work with the East. And that lack of a united front left a massive opening right in the center of Europe.
It just allowed the fascist states to expand through the middle without facing a consolidated wall of opposition.
It's like watching two neighbors argue bitterly over a property line while a burglar just walks right through the front door.
That is a disturbingly accurate analogy.
Yeah.
And the burglar definitely knows the neighbors aren't talking to each other.
Oh, he's counting on it.
So the democracies are paralyzed by their distrust of the Soviets. But they also had to deal with their own internal ghosts, right? Which brings us to appeasement.
Yes, the infamous policy.
And I know, historically speaking, appeasement is basically a dirty word. It's a synonym for cowardice now.
Yeah.
We all picture Neville Chamberlain waving that little piece of paper.
Peace for our time.
Exactly. But looking at the breakdown of the public mood in the sources, it feels a lot more complicated than just cowardice.
It is very easy for us to judge from the safety of the future. But if you look at the rationale described in the historical analysis, it really wasn't cowardice. It was trauma.
Yeah.
You have to look at the demographics. France, specifically, had lost nearly 1.4 million men in World War I.
Which is just a staggering number to try and comprehend. I was reading that in terms of the active male population, France was essentially hollowed out.
It was a demographic black hole. An entire generation was just gone. So when we see leaders like Daladier or Chamberlain acting weak, they are actually operating under a crushing political mandate from their own people.
Which was basically, do not kill another generation.
Completely. It was political suicide to even propose war. The voters wanted peace at any price.
So they felt they had to avoid war no matter what.
Yes. So the leaders convinced themselves of a comfortable lie. They decided Hitler was a rational actor.
Right.
They believed he had reasonable grievances regarding the Treaty of Versailles, which, let's be honest, was incredibly harsh on Germany.
And just punishing, yeah.
And they thought that if they just fixed those specific grievances, he would finally be satisfied and settle down.
They thought they were negotiating a business deal, just adjusting the terms of a bad contract.
Right.
But they were actually feeding a shark.
That's exactly it. They completely failed to understand that for the fascist regimes, the grievances weren't the point.
The expansion was the point.
The ideology demanded it. It was built on militarism, expansionism, and in Germany's case, a racist pursuit of living space, or Lebensraum.
And while all this psychological drama is happening, there's supposed to be a referee on the field, right? The League of Nations.
The organization designed specifically to prevent this exact scenario.
But reading the case studies from the sources here, the League feels less like a referee and more like, I don't know, a disappointed parent.
A disappointed parent with zero actual authority.
Yeah.
The source material is honestly pretty savage about the League's ineffectiveness. It points out that when aggression actually happened, the League responded with lame economic sanctions.
Sanctions with no muscle behind them.
Not at all.
Well, let's look at the first big test case mentioned in the timeline, which is the invasion of Ethiopia in 1935.
Right.
Mussolini sends Italian troops into one of the very few independent, non-colonized African nations.
Which was a blatant act of colonial aggression. It violated every single principle the League supposedly stood for.
And it wasn't just about high-minded principles either. The analysis notes that this invasion actually directly threatened British interests, specifically control of the Suez Canal.
It did. The Suez was the absolute lifeline of the British Empire. So you would think, okay, this is it, the gloves finally come off.
But they didn't. The League imposed sanctions, but, and this detail honestly drives me crazy, they didn't ban oil.
Right. They banned luxury goods and certain loans, but they kept the oil flowing to the Italian military.
Which is what they needed to fight the war.
Exactly. And they didn't close the Suez Canal to Italian ships either. Mussolini essentially told them, if you close the canal, I will consider that an act of war.
And the British and French just backed down.
They blinked.
So they imposed sanctions that were incredibly annoying to Italy, but not actually crippling.
It was the absolute worst of both worlds. It angered Italy just enough to drive Mussolini closer to Hitler, but it wasn't strong enough to actually stop the invasion of Ethiopia.
It just signaled to every dictator in the world that the whole collective security system was a giant bluff.
It proved there were no consequences.
Which brings us directly to the next year, 1936. The remilitarization of the Rhineland.
Yes.
And reading the details of this specific event, it feels like the single biggest what-if of the entire 20th century.
It is the great turning point. I call it the ultimate litmus test. The Rhineland, for context, was the buffer zone between Germany and France.
Right.
Under the Treaty of Versailles, no German troops were allowed anywhere near there. It was France's main security guarantee.
So Hitler just decides to march his troops right into this forbidden zone. But here's the detail in the timeline that really gets me. This wasn't some confident, unstoppable march of a superpower.
Not at all.
When German troops crossed into the Rhineland in 1936, they were apparently terrified.
It was a total gamble on Hitler's part. The orders the German generals carried that day are fascinating. They had strict instructions that at the very first sign of French resistance...
Even just a warning shot, right?
Exactly. Even a warning shot, they were to turn around and retreat immediately.
So Hitler is betting his entire political reputation on the idea that France effectively just won't show up to work.
He's betting heavily on their psychological paralysis, and unfortunately, he was entirely right.
Wow.
The French army was massive compared to the German forces at this point. They could have crushed the German advance in a single afternoon.
But they didn't.
No. The French government was in disarray, they were terrified of sparking a wider conflict, and they looked across the channel to Britain for backup.
And I'm looking at the British response in the sources here. Lord Lothian famously said, after all, they are only going into their own back garden.
Which sounds perfectly reasonable in a vacuum, doesn't it?
Sure.
It was German territory, but strategically, it was a complete disaster.
I know so.
Because once Germany fortified the Rhineland, they effectively closed the door to the west. It meant France couldn't easily march into Germany to help their allies in the east, like Poland or Czechoslovakia later on.
Oh, wow.
That back garden comment completely missed the strategic reality of what was happening.
And it fundamentally changed the psychology of the German military, too, didn't it? Because before this, the sources say the generals were deeply skeptical of Hitler. They thought he was reckless.
But after the Rhineland, he looked like an absolute genius to them. He had defied the world powers and won without firing a single shot.
It just emboldened him to speed up the rearmament.
Yes, it solidified his control over the army and the German people.
So the gambler wins the first hand, and now he's feeling lucky. Which leads us to 1938, the Anschluss, the annexation of Austria.
This is where the ideology of pan-Germanism really kicks into high gear. Hitler wanted to unite all German-speaking people under one flag. He marches into Austria, and once again, the West does absolutely nothing.
But I want to talk about the vote that happened afterwards. Because the Nazis loved to wrap their raw aggression in the language of legality.
Always.
They actually held a plebiscite to ask the Austrian people if they approved of the annexation.
And if you look at the actual ballot from that vote in the historical records, it's almost comical if it weren't so dark.
The yes circle was huge and planted right in the center of the page, and the no circle was this tiny little dot off to the corner.
And there was zero secrecy. You didn't get a private booth. You had to fill it out right in front of armed stormtroopers. The final official result was 99.7% in favor.
99.7%. I mean, that's not a statistic, that's a fiction.
It was pure theater, coercion masquerading as democracy. But it served a very specific purpose internationally.
It gave the West an out.
Exactly. It allowed Britain and France to shrug their shoulders and say, well, the people seem to want it. National self-determination, right? It gave them a convenient excuse to look away.
And looking away leads us right to the climax of appeasement. September 1938, the Munich Agreement. This is really the moment that defined the entire era.
The crisis over the Sudetenland. This was the border region of Czechoslovakia. It was heavily fortified, very mountainous, and full of ethnic German speakers.
And Hitler demands it.
Yes. He says, this is my last territorial claim in Europe. Just give me this and I'm done.
And the leaders of Britain and France, Chamberlain and Daladier, they actually fly to Munich. They sit down at a table with Hitler and Mussolini. But who is conspicuously missing from that room?
The Czechs.
Yeah.
The leaders of Czechoslovakia weren't even invited to the meeting that would decide the fate of their own country.
That is just wild.
They were literally waiting in a hotel room down the street just to be told the final result by the British and French.
That is incredibly cold.
It's brutal realpolitik. Chamberlain and Daladier essentially handed over the Sudetenland and, along with it, all of Czechoslovakia's natural border defenses directly to Hitler.
And in exchange, what do they get? A signature on a piece of paper promising no further expansion.
Peace for our time.
And the true tragedy here is that Chamberlain really seemed to believe it. He flew home to cheering crowds in London.
He did, but Winston Churchill, who was in the opposition at the time, saw it exactly for what it was. He famously said, "You were given the choice between war and dishonor. You chose dishonor, and you will have war."
And he was completely right. Because what happens next?
Less than 6 months later, Hitler completely breaks the pact. He marches his army into the rest of Czechoslovakia, the parts with no German speakers at all.
That must have been the moment the mask finally fell off for the West.
It absolutely was. You couldn't argue it was just about uniting Germans anymore. This was raw conquest. It proved once and for all that diplomatic promises were totally useless against fascist ambition.
Right.
You couldn't negotiate in good faith with someone who viewed treaties as temporary inconveniences.
So by the spring of 1939, everyone knows war is coming. Britain and France finally start drawing actual lines in the sand, specifically around Poland.
Yes.
But then comes the plot twist. The one that, honestly, based on the sources, I still find hard to wrap my head around.
The Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact,
Yeah.
the Nazi-Soviet non-aggression pact.
Right, because we started this whole conversation by saying these two ideologies, fascism and communism, were mortal enemies.
Yes.
That the whole reason the West wouldn't ally with Stalin earlier was because he and Hitler were polar opposites.
They were. Hitler's entire political career was built on militant anti-communism, and Stalin's propaganda machine spent years calling fascists the ultimate evil.
So why, in August 1939, did these two guys suddenly sign a 10-year friendship deal?
Well, it certainly wasn't friendship. It was cold, hard, cynical strategy. For Hitler, it was all about the map. He remembered World War I very clearly.
Because Germany fought on two fronts.
Exactly. Germany lost because it had to fight France in the west and Russia in the east simultaneously. He knew he couldn't invade Poland if it meant fighting the Soviet army immediately.
He needed to take the Soviets off the board before he made a move.
Exactly. And for Stalin, he knew the West wasn't going to help him. He deeply suspected that Britain and France were actually trying to push Hitler east so that the Nazis and Soviets would just destroy each other.
Ah.
So Stalin decided to buy himself some time to rebuild his own military, which he had recently purged.
But there was a secret sweetener in this deal too, right?
G-secret protocols, yes. They didn't just agree not to fight each other. They literally took out a map of Eastern Europe and drew a line right down the middle.
Unbelievable.
I take this half of Poland, you take that half.
It is the ultimate cynicism.
Yeah.
Two sworn enemies secretly carving up a sovereign country just to serve their own temporary strategic interests.
It was the final nail in the coffin for peace in Europe. The moment that pact was signed, the invasion of Poland became inevitable. Hitler had no more fear of a two-front war.
And 1 week later, September 1st, 1939.
The tanks roll across the Polish border. Britain and France, finally realizing they have no more room to retreat, declare war. The catastrophe begins.
When you look at it all laid out like that, Ethiopia, the Rhineland, Austria, Munich, the Soviet Pact, it's not just a random list of dates. It's a mechanism. It's an engine of confidence for the aggressors.
That's a really great way to put it. Each diplomatic failure by the West acted as direct fuel for the fascist regimes.
So if we have to distill this all down for you listening, if we're answering the core question of how did this happen, what are the main drivers the sources really identify here?
I'd synthesize the source material into three main failures. First, there's the systemic failure.
Okay.
The League of Nations and the Treaty of Versailles were entirely built on the idea that nations would voluntarily follow international rules, but they had no enforcement mechanism. And rules without teeth are just suggestions.
Right. If you don't enforce it, it doesn't exist.
Exactly. Second is the ideological paralysis. The fact that the capitalist democracies feared communism so much that they couldn't build a grand alliance to stop Hitler until it was entirely too late. That three-way cage match we talked about earlier.
And the third driver.
The misunderstanding of ambition. The persistent belief that you could satisfy a revolutionary expansionist regime with small territorial concessions. The leaders of the West failed to realize that for leaders like Hitler, compromise wasn't a path to peace. It was just a sign of weakness to be exploited.
It really challenges the way we generally think about peace. We tend to think of peace as the default state of the world and war as the weird aberration. But looking at the interwar period, it seems like peace is actually something you have to actively build and vigorously defend.
Absolutely. Peace isn't just the absence of fighting. It requires constant maintenance. And sometimes, and this is the really hard lesson of this era, it requires the willingness to confront aggression early when the cost of stopping it is still relatively low.
Yeah.
Stopping Hitler in the Rhineland in 1936 would have cost maybe a few hundred lives. Stopping him in 1939 cost tens of millions.
That is just a terrifying calculus to think about.
It is, but it's the harsh reality of geopolitics.
Before we wrap up, I want to leave you with a thought to mull over, something that connects this history to the world we live in right now. We talked a lot about the League of Nations and their heavy reliance on economic sanctions.
The tool that utterly failed to save Ethiopia.
Right. But we still use economic sanctions today. It's almost always the international community's first response to aggression because, understandably, we always want to avoid the horror of war. So here's the question for you to explore on your own.
Go for it.
In a world of rising aggression, is economic pressure ever really enough to truly stop a power that is ideologically committed to expansion? Or is collective security basically a myth without the credible threat of military force behind it?
That is the exact question that keeps diplomats up at night to this very day.
Think about that. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive into the failure of peace. We'll see you next time.